Donald Morton, a taxi driver, has casual conversation with two of his passengers as he drives them to their destination, as if they were close personal friends of his, except they aren't friends of his, and they aren't even listening to what he's saying, much less speaking English. Thanks to Donald's autism, he's not very good at understanding social cues or making conversation, like most people. So he doesn't quite register that the Japanese businessmen in his backseat don't care about the fact that he frequently loses these taxi jobs, or that he can see and track the deployment of the entire fleet in his mind. But they do look up and pay attention when he crashes the taxi into the back of a flower van. People crowd around to check out the accident, but Donald seems to space out as the van owner yells at him, and simply picks up his budgie, collects his groceries from the back seat, and calmly leaves the scene, abandoning both the vehicle and its passengers as if nothing just happened. Donald heads to an adult autism support group that he's personally set up for others like him. Each member is at different points of the spectrum, each with unique mannerisms, symptoms, and quirks. Janice is blunt and loud, and yells at Donald about being late to his own group, while Bloom, who thinks everything belongs to him, tries to swipe the newly bought groceries from Donald's hands in Skeet's mixer. Gracie wears an almost permanent, unnerving smile, while Roger, who's obsessed with the weather, recites facts about the rainfall in Sri Lanka, and Gregory, who fancies himself a writer, rants about his work being critiqued. Bronwyn walks around in her usual daze, mumbling nonsense about her parents picking her up at the bulletin board, and Janice breaks her loop, claiming there's no such board, which sends her on another loop of trying to convince herself that regular people lose autistic people all the time. Donald calls Gracie over to give her instructions on how he wants to run the meeting today, but as he glances at the microwave, he's distracted by the numbers. He can't help but break them down in his head, and he ends up going on a tangent before Gracie snaps him out of it. He instructs her to gather all the women and head to the bleachers, he'll take the men, so that the group can practice telling personal stories. He notices before they leave that a new person has signed up for their group, Isabel Sorensen, and asks Gracie to allow her to introduce herself to the group first. At the park, Isabel is a little nervous at first, but begins sharing facts and stories about her experience with autism. Being diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, one of the things she's susceptible to is taking things very literally. When Isabel was a child, she saw her parents get very excited about an Olympic athlete breaking a world record, and, misunderstanding, she thought that if she broke her parents' physical records, the ones that played music, that they would celebrate her too. The neighborhood children who saw her doing this called her a monster, and she barked like a dog at them, to prove that she could do anything anyone else could. On the other side of the park, Donald tells his story to the men. By the time he was 2, his parents had already noticed that he wasn't their ideal child. Donald was very good with numbers, an ability often treated like a party trick by other, normal children. They used him for entertainment, and then walked away when they were bored. Donald admits that people with Asperger's want contact with others very much. They're just hopelessly clueless at it. Isabel was on her own by the age of 14, and she recounts to the group that one day, while hitchhiking, she was by a man who offered her a ride. This trauma manipulated her young, impressionable mind into thinking that if she gave her body to men, perhaps they would want her around more. The story makes Gracie burst into a fit of manic laughter, and Janice is thoroughly disgusted at the mention of sex, running over to Donald, who steps in to mediate. He tries finding out what went wrong, but communication between him and Isabel breaks down pretty quickly, with neither of them making a lot of sense, or saying much relevant to the actual issue. However, they do find that they have one thing in common, never knowing what to say. Isabel finds the interaction funny, but then quickly gets dejected and leaves the group. When Donald gets home that evening, he tells his birds all about Isabel as he heats up his regular frozen TV dinner. He finds numerical differences in their dates of birth, the number of letters in their names, and enjoys obsessing over something he finds beautiful, for once. Isabel can't seem to stop herself from thinking about him either, gossiping about him to her pet bunny Bongo, as she styles a sleeping client's hair. Donald tries to call her one day, but gets nervous when she answers the phone and hangs up. Another day at the support group, Isabel finds herself in a conversation with Gregory, discussing his oeuvre and how repulsive it is to women. When she asks him a very direct and inappropriate question about his past activity that seems to scare him away. Curious, Donald gently probes Gregory on what the conversation was about, and Gregory reveals he intends to take Isabel to the Halloween party coming up soon. But he was too afraid to ask her just now, so he begs Donald to ask her out on his behalf. The interaction is interrupted when Bloom snatches Bronwyn's cookie, and Isabel tries to get him to give it back, but she's very loud and aggressive, and it's not conducive to solving the dispute. Donald steps in, quickly calming Bloom, stopping Isabel's meltdown, and replacing Bronwyn's cookie in one fell swoop. Impressed, Isabel thanks him, and the two finally share a conversation. Donald manages to crack a joke, something not very common for people with Asperger's, who take things very literally, and Isabel laughs. Donald tries to mention he has something important to tell Isabel, and she takes the opportunity to ask Donald out to lunch the next day, before she quickly goes to feed her animals. At home, he practices greeting Isabel in the mirror before their date. Donald and Isabel meet at the zoo the next day. Isabel is enthralled with the animals, and people watch her quizzically as she makes faces at a caged mandrill. Leaving the mandrill exhibit, Donald can't help but calculate the amount of time a mandrill spends eating breakfast in its lifetime, making Isabel chortle a laugh. Mildly self-conscious, Donald offers to try and stop seeing and counting numbers everywhere, if it annoys her, but Isabel doesn't want him to stop. She likes hearing his random calculations. It's part of who he is, and she knows he can't help it, since he's autistic. She has quirks she can't help too, confiding that hearing the sound of clanging metal sends her into a panic attack. In her own case, as an adult, Isabel has come to terms with the fact that the things she does will always shock and confuse people, so now, she simply tries to make it work to her advantage wherever she can. She has a tendency to always say what she thinks with little to no censorship. It isn't because she thinks what she has to say is always good, but because she simply doesn't know how to filter her thoughts and words. She worries that her directness is what scared the women at the support group when she told them her story, and hopes they'll forgive her for triggering them. Donald validates Isabel's experience with the group by admitting the topic she brought up should never be laughed at. Isabel acknowledges how brave Donald was in speaking up, and puts it out in the open that he's attracted to her, rather matter-of-factly. Donald blushes, unsure of how to respond, but Isabel takes lead of the conversation again by asking Donald what he needed to tell her. He admits he came only to try to set her up with Gregory for the Halloween party, trying to act as if her going with Gregory doesn't affect him, as he doesn't attend the Halloween party at all. To Donald, his friends dress up on Halloween to hide who they truly are, but his costume reveals his true nature. Curiosity piqued, Isabel proposes that instead of going to the party, she and Donald dress up and meet at the mall instead. The day of the date, Donald anxiously practices greeting Isabel again, a whole 9 hours and 37 minutes early to his date. Later on though, Isabel, dressed as Mozart, stands in the center of the mall waiting for Donald. Donald's anxiety has now caused him to ironically be late, and he slowly puts on his costume, procrastinating leaving the house. Isabel waits and waits while Donald stalls and stalls, till he's a whole hour late, and just as he's talking himself out of going, the doorbell rings. Isabel, figuring he's screwed up and was too anxious to leave the house, has come to collect him, because she understands it's a symptom of his autism. She's not even mad. She greets him with a flourish, compliments his costume, and drags him out of the house with an eager smile. They get off the bus, and Donald lumbers around in his whale costume, following Isabel's excited skipping through town. She's curious as to why his true identity is a whale. Donald relates to whales because he's felt as though his entire life he was on the sidelines, watching a parade go by, but when you're a whale, you are the parade. Donald shares more of his story with her as they traverse the town, till they finally await the last bus together. Isabel tries to kiss him, but the whale costume gets in the way. Just as she gets the costume off, the bus arrives, and she rushes to give Donald their first passionate kiss before jumping on the bus, giggling like a schoolgirl. As she waves goodbye, she tells a still stupefied Donald to call her, but when the glow of the kiss wears off, Donald realizes she never said when. At home, Isabel sits painting a mural on her wall with one hand while writing a composition with the other, her animals crawling all over the apartment. The phone rings, going to the answering machine, and Donald speaks, apologizing for the 7 messages he left previously, and saying goodbye to her, thinking that she's going to disappear on him after their kiss. Hearing the finality to his tone, Isabel rushes over to the phone to answer, and confesses to Donald that she ignored his calls because she wasn't sure what to say. He distracts her from her anxieties by asking her out on a date to the amusement park. While on the Ferris wheel, the stark contrast in their personalities is very apparent as Donald cowers, trying not to look too hard at anything, while Isabel stands up in the rocky cabin, excitedly leaning over, jumping up and exclaiming at the view. As they walk around the park, Donald explains to Isabel how he sees numbers in his head. When he sees one, he shoots prime numbers at it, like in an arcade game, and that's how he breaks them down so quickly. Isabel finds his process fascinating, praising his intelligence. Donald, getting excited and more enthusiastic, walks over to the ring toss game, trying to further impress Isabel by showing her an easy way to win. Without thinking about it, he scoops up a large handful of the small metal rings for the game and throws them at the bottle. Isabel screams, grabbing her head in pain due to the hypersensitivity of her Asperger's, and drops to her knees. It takes Donald a moment to realize what's going on, but as a crowd gathers around Isabel, he rushes to her side. Isabel, still shaking, begs to go home. The couple head back to Donald's apartment, where Isabel is introduced to his birds, which take an immediate liking to her. They sit on the couch, and Donald tries to play the gracious host, offering Isabel food. Exasperated at Donald's naivety, she abruptly propositions him instead. Donald is extremely antsy about being physical. He hasn't in a very long time, but Isabel insists she wants to be with him, assuring him that he couldn't disappoint her. Through her harsh life experiences, Isabel knows now that there are many men that would bet her, but very few that would love or accept her for who she is, who would be with her. She assures him that she wants him, no matter what. Donald finally accepts, and the two spend the night together. The next morning, Donald wakes to find the bed empty and rants to his birds, thinking that he's disappointed Isabel last night, and she's abandoned him. Isabel interrupts him, catching him in the middle of his rant as she re-enters the apartment with groceries and Bongo in tow. She cheekily explains she just went to feed her animals, and Donald, embarrassed, resigns himself to completing the dishes. When the couple arrive at the support group, they find that Gregory has told the entire group about their relationship, and a few members interrogate them. Gregory rants about being betrayed by Donald, and he's forced to call a meeting, asking the entire group how they feel about his and Isabel's relationship. A few members make a fuss about it, but when Gracie is asked how she feels, she reveals she's sad, because Bronwyn's father has been diagnosed with cancer. The entire mood of the room shifts, with some people looking mildly ashamed of themselves for focusing on Izzy and Donald's relationship when Bronwyn was going through something so serious. Donald attempts to comfort her, but Bronwyn's highly emotional state prompts her loop. She has to go meet her parents at the bulletin board, though it fizzles out halfway, as if her spirit isn't even strong enough for the constant repetition today. In an attempt at comforting her, Isabel offers to wait with Bronwyn at the bulletin board, even though she knows her parents won't come. One day, Izzy takes it upon herself to thoroughly clean and organize Donald's filthy apartment. But when Donald gets home and everything looks completely different from how he left it, he starts freaking out. Even though one of Izzy's quirks is a strict kind of cleanliness, it greatly juxtaposes Donald's quirk of hoarding old things. People with Asperger's tend to live with certain strict routines. They like consistency, so the sudden, huge change to his environment sends Donald spiraling. Furious, Donald wakes Izzy from her slumber, demanding to know where all his things are. Izzy can see that he's spiraling, but is confused as to why. Everything is still there, it's just organized, though Donald doesn't see it that way. He feels Izzy was too invasive, that she had no right to just come in and steal his life like this. Objects like his moldy shower curtain hold no meaning to her, but they did for him. Donald heads to the parking garage to go through his calming ritual of going through all the numbers on the license plates, and ends up confiding his troubles in a homeless man. Isabel goes back to her place and ignores Donald's calls for days, still upset, until one day he shows up at her work, wearing the suit she bought him. He spots her, but of course, thanks to his autism, doesn't know what to say, so he nervously shifts around in front of her for a while before she makes it easy on him, giving him an opening. Finally, he turns, fighting the natural urge within him to avoid eye contact, and apologizes to Izzy in front of her coworkers. Elated, she introduces him to the entire shop as her boyfriend, as if officially debuting their relationship. Later that evening, Izzy leads Donald to a spot she's found in what appears to be an abandoned hotel. She's laid out a lounging area in a spot where she can see the sky. She confesses that she originally cleaned Donald's apartment so that they could have friends over, and reveals that she's been looking for a small house they could afford. Donald, always concerned with numbers, can't fathom how they'd be able to afford it, since he is jobless, but Izzy has that handled too. She asked the woman who diagnosed her to help set Donald up with any available positions at the University Medical Center. Donald is reluctant, not liking being forced into things, but he wants to make Isabel happy. At the interview, Donald is very antsy, and won't make any eye contact with the interviewer whatsoever. To Donald's surprise, the interviewer is handling his abrupt and seemingly rude responses in stride. As he's already aware Donald is autistic, he only cares about his abilities, and Donald lands the job. The couple moves into their new house shortly after, and the time spent living together is wonderful. They learn more about each other, and come to respect each other's quirks as time passes on. Donald would pass by Izzy's room and constantly admire her unique creative expression, while Izzy would leave Donald's trash in his space, allowing him his sense of control. The couple learn to play and laugh together, while also helping each other slowly overcome their respective autism-related constrictions. One morning, as Izzy hands Donald his lunch before he heads off to work, he admits he wants to express something important to her, but is worried about how she'll react, knowing how emotional she can get. Izzy reassures him he can tell her. Donald's boss is coming over for dinner tonight, so he confides in Izzy that he wants everything to be nice, genuinely trying to impress him. As Donald has come to respect his boss, the former interviewer, and enjoys his job at the analytics department very much, he doesn't want to appear mentally unstable or unreliable to his superior. Izzy appears to take Donald's comment well at first, but pouts the moment he turns his back to head for work, slamming the door as she enters the house. That evening, when Donald arrives home with his boss, all the animals are out of their cages, roaming freely around the house, despite what Donald asked Izzy for. Embarrassed, Donald quickly tries to wrangle all the birds, while his boss, Hank Wallace, looks around the strange house curiously. They find Izzy in the backyard, lounging as if she were an old Hollywood diva, and when Donald introduces her to Hank, she sarcastically divulges that she's been notified to be on her best behavior tonight, and he's welcome to notify her if she deviates from normalcy at any time. As she skips back inside, she welcomes Hank to come inside and eat some vegetable lasagna. At dinner, Isabel drinks heavily, and with every passing moment, her behavior is becoming more erratic, despite how polite and understanding their guest is trying to be. Hank compliments her paintings, and she refers to them as violent and insane, then rants about how she's basically a failure, criticizing and berating herself in front of him. Donald tries rebutting every one of her self-deprecating comments with a compliment, or a trait he finds positive about her, but it falls on deaf ears. Isabel ramps up the act, announcing to Hank their crazy plans to renovate the house with a sandbox in the living room, an aviary in the back, and a piano in the yard. She puts Bongo in Hank's lap while he's still eating, and the rabbit fights to get out of his hands. Donald keeps trying to interject with random small talk, in an attempt to defuse the quickly escalating situation, but Isabel criticizes him for it, calling the behavior very autistic. She resumes her seat, but keeps ranting on and on about luxurious fabrics and carpets and paints for the house, while Donald slowly raises his hand, the pressure building in him. As she jabbers on, Donald, unable to take any more, slams his hand down on the table. After Hank leaves, they have a heated argument. Donald is afraid he's going to lose his job because his boss will think he's crazy, but as far as Isabel is concerned, he wouldn't even have got that job if it weren't for her. Donald feels confused though, as she only got the job for him so that he could help her afford the house and the luxuries she wanted. But Isabel did it out of the goodness of her heart. She pushed Donald into getting the job so that he could be proud of himself. Isabel compromised and put up with things she didn't like sometimes, because she hoped that he would do the same for her. She feels extremely slighted that he would ask her to be normal for his boss, as if she is some sort of freak, when she was just being herself. She finds his criticism hypocritical. After all, they both have Asperger's, and when they met, Isabel was considerably more hygienic and well socialized. She's disappointed to see Donald bend over backwards like this for the approval of normal people, and she concludes that this is the key difference between them. Isabel never wanted to be normal. She dumps Donald, kicking him out of the house in a rage. Despite dumping him, Isabel doesn't look like she's doing well. Donald, of course, keeps obsessively calling her, and one day, while at Gregory's apartment, where he's now staying, he replays a voicemail Izzy left on Greg's machine for him for the 32nd time. She isn't mad anymore, but she doesn't want him to call, reassuring him she's fine. Izzy blames herself and her poor track record with relationships, knowing that at some point, she'd break Donald's heart. Noticing how depressed he's been lately, Roger tries to cheer Donald up by suggesting the group go whale watching in this ideal weather. Gracie isn't into it at first, but Gregory assists in convincing her. The rest of the group also come together and agree to go, all trying to be supportive towards Donald. Gracie even tries offering to call Isabel for Donald, but it just depresses him more. Donald tries to retreat from them, but Gregory and the group follow after him. One day, when Donald arrives back at Greg's place, he notices the answering machine has 17 messages, and Greg confirms they're not for him. Scooping up the phone, he plays the messages to find out that Bongo, Isabel's beloved rabbit, has passed, and from the sound of her voice, she isn't taking it well. Speeding over to their old house, he finds her curled up at a huge memorial she's built in the backyard for Bongo. She's grateful he's come, and the two admit having missed each other. Isabel desperately asks Donald if they could be friends, but also brings up marriage, which she never has before, claiming Donald always made it seem as though that was what he expected of her. It was the first Donald heard or even thought of it, but he puts it aside for the moment and accepts her request to remain friends, without the pressure, but possibly still with physical intimacy. The open-ended nature of her request and the mixed signals Donald receives sends him into a bout of overthinking. He tries discussing it with Greg, attempting to figure out what she really means, or what she really wants. Greg thinks he should take her at face value. Women like her are often direct when they want something, especially being physical or marriage, but Donald knows Isabel very well, and he isn't so sure about that. One night, Donald takes Isabel to dinner at a very exclusive, expensive restaurant that Hank recommended to him, the best place in town. When Isabel walks in, she's elated and immediately taken with the sophisticated atmosphere of the place, even though her loud and brash reactions to everything don't fit the atmosphere. As they're seated, Donald mentions he has something special he wishes to talk about, and Izzy berates him till he's forced to spit it out before he feels he's ready. Donald doesn't think Izzy knows what she wants, bringing up the fact that she set him up with a job, convinced him to get a house. She keeps bringing him back into her life, and now suddenly she mentioned marriage today. Surely, she wants that. Donald confesses he wants marriage too, because he considers her his only chance at love. Although Isabel, taking things literally, misinterprets what he means. She assumes he means that she's his only chance at a wife because they're both autistic. What he actually means is that she's the only person he loves, but he's unable to clearly express the feeling how he wants to. Isabel boils with emotions, slamming her palm on the table, and Donald begs her not to make a scene, which instantly makes things worse. Isabel explodes, screaming that she didn't want Donald to be her hero, and that she wanted to be left alone. The crowd in the restaurant all stare at her as she storms out, and Donald sits there, awkward and ashamed. Donald paces back and forth in the parking garage, trying to calm down. He completely blames himself for Isabel's meltdown. Meanwhile, back at the house, Isabel mixes a concoction of different pills, drinking them down in an attempt to. Luckily for her, Donald feels so guilty about pressuring her into marriage. He decides to go to his old home, and finds her soon enough that she can receive medical treatment. Donald waits with the entire group in the waiting room of the hospital, until he's eventually greeted by Dr. Jeffries, Isabel's psychiatrist. Isabel is fine, and the doctors have released her on account of the fact that she'll be attending therapy. Donald tries to suggest he could be her listening ear, that he can improve, but the doctor doesn't think so, knowing how difficult managing Asperger's can be. Before he leaves, the doctor warns Donald off trying to see or call Isabel, claiming she doesn't want to see him. The group immediately start trying their best to keep Donald from calling her, knowing that he will obsess over it and possibly make the situation worse. They try to distract him with numbers and even physically keep him from the phone. But Donald is hard to reason with. He's afraid that if he doesn't call Isabel, then she'll think he doesn't love her anymore and get further depressed. Gregory talks him down, reminding him that she's very emotionally volatile, and she could try hurting herself again if provoked. But Donald is at a loss for how to keep from calling her. Gregory suggests a nicotine patch of sorts. Donald's nicotine patches come in the form of post-it notes with large numbers on them, stuck everywhere they can fit, but most days are a constant battle of self-control. Payphones, and even the office phone, come with difficulties, and he releases these tensions in any way possible. One time, throwing the company phone away. One day, at the university campus, he sees the back of a figure that's undoubtedly Isabel, and starts chasing after her, but loses her after she jumps onto a bus. Nervously, Donald paces at the bus stop, waiting for the next bus so that he can follow her. While on the bus, he anxiously keeps looking out the windows at the street to see if he can spot where Isabel went, when he notices the red door to their little hidden spot is swung wide open. He screams for the bus to stop and runs out, speeding up the stairs and frantically searching past the metal beams, till finally, he finds her in their sacred space, lighting candles on the broken chandelier. She teases him about never calling, and he apologizes, confessing that he wanted to, but thought better of it, not wanting to force his way into her life again. Isabel admits she hated him for not calling, and thought it meant he didn't love her anymore, just as he suspected she would. Though she wants to be with him, she's not sure she can promise him the future. She doesn't know how long they'll have together. But Donald doesn't see this as a problem. He's glad they've finally found one thing that's normal about their relationship. Eventually, the two get married and become stable enough to afford a larger house where they host an exuberant Thanksgiving dinner for the members of the support group. Isabel commences the festivities with a loving toast to Donald, and the group jovially feast as a family.